I only needed shelter. But that wooden soldier had been guarding something for me.
She was 23 and broke. No apartment, no savings, no second chance, just a canvas bag and the $9 she had counted 3 times after her last bank card stopped working. And with that $9, she bought a forgotten Nutcracker carver's workshop outside Leavenworth, Chelan County, Washington, a place that had fallen off local maps in 1987. The roof leaked above the collapsed carving room. The rear wall sagged with rotted cedar supports. Chelan County condemned the building on October 14th, 2023, with demolition scheduled for the winter season. Behind a life-sized wooden Nutcracker's lever block sat a hidden copper compartment unopened for decades, holding a record and a forgotten sum that would change Phoebe's life. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Phoebe had been searching for a place to belong her whole life without knowing it. She was born in a small rental house outside Wenatchee, where winter mornings arrived with frost on the inside of the kitchen window and the sound of her father sharpening pencils for work. Her earliest memories were not of expensive things or large rooms. They were of careful hands, repaired objects, and the quiet habit of making something last longer than people expected. Her father left when she was young, but her mother kept one tradition alive. Every Saturday morning they visited old markets and estate sales, not to buy valuable things, but to find forgotten tools that still carried the marks of someone else's labor. Phoebe learned that worn wood could hold a story and that a repaired hinge could reveal patience. The person who shaped that understanding most was her grandfather's older friend, Phoebe Voss, a retired woodworker who lived near the edge of town in a small cedar house, filled with carved animals and unfinished projects. Elias had learned traditional carving from his father, who had learned it from a German immigrant craftsman. On weekends, when Phoebe was 12, she sat at his workbench while he restored old wooden toys and carved small nutcrackers by hand. He never rushed the blade. He measured twice, listened to the grain, and waited for the wood to reveal where it wanted to separate. His workshop smelled of beeswax, cedar dust, and coffee that had been sitting too long in a metal cup. The walls held clamps, carving knives, hand planes, and sketches drawn decades earlier. Phoebe would sweep the floor while Elias worked, and he always told her that cleaning a workspace was part of making something. One afternoon, while repairing a cracked wooden soldier's arm, Elias placed the tool in her hand and said, "Wood remembers every careless hand and every patient one." He meant that craftsmanship was not about forcing an object into shape. It was about learning enough to cooperate with what was already there. Elias died during Phoebe's final year of high school. After the funeral, his workshop was emptied before she could return. The old carving knives, the patterns, and the unfinished Nutcracker figures disappeared into storage boxes belonging to distant relatives. The only thing Phoebe kept was a small wooden shaving from his workbench tucked inside a notebook. Years later, when Phoebe was working at a small accounting company in Seattle, that memory seemed far away. She had built a normal life. She rented a small room, saved what she could, and trusted the man she had been dating for 3 years. His name was Marcus. He knew exactly how to sound supportive when Phoebe worried about money. He told her he could help organize her savings, that couples should trust each other, that he was protecting their future. Then the company collapsed. The layoffs came quickly. Her final paycheck vanished into unpaid bills. While she was trying to understand what had happened, Marcus transferred the emergency savings account into another account under his control. 2 days later, his apartment key was left on the kitchen counter, and his phone stopped connecting. There was no argument, no explanation, only an empty space where a person had been. Phoebe spent the next week trying to solve problems that had already become impossible. The landlord waited until the morning of March 3, 2024, then placed her belongings outside the door of the room she could no longer afford. The object she remembered most was not the locked door. It was the blue ceramic mug her mother had given her years earlier, sitting beside a cardboard box filled with clothes. Her mother arrived that afternoon, stood beside the boxes, and looked toward the apartment window. She did not defend Phoebe. She did not ask Marcus where the money went. She only whispered, "I cannot get involved," then walked back to her car. The landlord folded his arms near the doorway and said, "You cannot stay here after today, Phoebe." She answered with exactly 8 words. "Please just let me collect my things first." For 6 weeks, Phoebe moved through Washington with a canvas bag, a notebook, and less money each day. She slept one night beneath the covered entrance of a closed bookstore in Wenatchee, 3 nights in a bus station waiting area in Spokane, and several nights in her car when she still had enough fuel to move between towns. Her remaining cash changed slowly from dollars into coins. A breakfast from a gas station became half a breakfast. A warm drink became tap water. She washed her clothes in public restroom sinks and dried them on the back seat while rain tapped against the glass. By early April, she had reached Leavenworth because the town library allowed people to sit indoors for long hours without questions. The building was quiet except for turning pages, printer sounds, and the soft footsteps of people looking for information. That was where she found the advertisement. It was printed on a faded sheet from a local property listing archive. The description was short: Old Nutcracker Carving Workshop. Former owner deceased. Structure condemned. Buyer responsible for removal. Price, $9. Most people would have seen a problem. Phoebe saw a door. She asked the librarian. A woman named Margaret, with silver hair pinned tightly behind her head. If the listing was real. Margaret studied the paper, then looked at Phoebe's worn jacket and canvas bag. "Nobody has wanted that place for years," she said. Phoebe folded the page carefully and placed it inside her notebook beside the small shaving of cedar she had kept from Elias's workbench. The next morning, she bought a one-way bus ticket east with the final bills in her pocket. She had no plan beyond reaching the workshop before someone else decided it was worth less than the cost of tearing it down. The old carving house waited at the end of a forgotten road, holding a secret no one had opened in decades. The bus left Phoebe at the edge of Leavenworth just after sunrise, where the mountains stood dark against a pale winter sky, and the road carried only the sound of tires passing over frozen gravel. The final 40 miles had taken longer than expected. A delayed route, a missed connection, and a 3-hour wait beside a rural station had turned the journey into a slow movement through cold country. By the time she stepped onto the shoulder of County Shop Road, the temperature had fallen to 18 degrees Fahrenheit. She walked the remaining 7 miles. Her canvas bag pulled against her shoulder. Her boots were wet from crossing a shallow drainage ditch near an old hayfield. That night, when daylight disappeared, she found an empty hay barn with a broken side door and slept beneath a folded tarp beside old bales that still smelled faintly of summer grass. She woke before dawn with frost along the edges of her coat. The walk continued. Leavenworth appeared slowly, not like a city but like a village placed carefully between mountains. The Bavarian-style buildings, wooden balconies, and winter decorations made the town feel preserved. But behind the painted facades were ordinary people opening shops and carrying boxes through back doors. Before reaching the clerk's office, Phoebe passed the places that kept the town alive, the wooden tables outside Munchen House waiting for lunch customers, the glass windows of a book for all seasons filled with winter novels, the shelves of Dan's Food Market where residents bought groceries, the old storefront of Kris Kringle with its Christmas ornaments, and the quiet entrance of Nutcracker Museum where carved wooden figures watched from behind glass. The town had not forgotten the craft. It had only forgotten one workshop. The Chelan County Clerk's office sat inside a plain brick building away from the tourist streets. Phoebe pushed open the door and stepped into warm air that smelled of paper, coffee, and old wood furniture. Behind the front counter sat a woman with short white hair and a navy cardigan. A small silver watch hung loosely around her wrist, and she organized documents into exact stacks before looking up. Her nameplate read, Margaret Holloway, Property Records Clerk. Phoebe placed the folded advertisement on the counter. "I am here about the workshop," she said. Margaret looked at the paper, then at Phoebe. "You understand it has no utilities?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the county has condemned parts of the structure?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the repairs may cost more than the property is worth?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand nobody will guarantee that it can be saved?" Phoebe placed her hand on the edge of the counter. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret studied her for a moment. Then she opened a drawer and removed a thin file folder. "The deed is simple," she said. "The responsibility is not." Inside were old inspection papers, ownership records, and a transfer form waiting for a signature. Phoebe signed slowly. The brass stamp came down with a heavy sound. A small circle of ink marked the date. Margaret slid the papers across the counter. "The road is called Old Mill Spur. Follow it past the creek bridge. You will see a stand of walnut trees. The workshop is beyond them." Phoebe folded the deed and placed it inside her coat. As Margaret returned the old file to the cabinet, she stopped. Her hand remained on the drawer handle. "Your last name," she said quietly. Phoebe looked back. "What about it?" Margaret removed the file again and opened an older page. "Voss." The room became still. "I knew an Elias Voss," Margaret said. "He came here every month for nearly 30 years. Brought carved figures for local displays. He talked about one person more than anyone." Phoebe did not answer. "His young student," Margaret continued. "A girl who listened before she learned." The words sat between them. Margaret looked at the cedar shaving tucked inside Phoebe's notebook when she opened it to store the deed. "He gave you something?" Phoebe nodded. Margaret closed the folder gently. Then maybe this place was not waiting for just anyone. The walk to the workshop took another hour. Old Mill Spur narrowed into a dirt road bordered by frozen grass. A neighbour named Harold Pike waved from a small farmhouse porch and pointed toward the trees. "That place?" Phoebe nodded. Harold looked toward the road. "My dog refuses to go near it," he said. The dog, a brown shepherd mix with a torn left ear, stood behind him watching silently. "Why?" Harold shrugged. "Probably because he has better judgment than me." Beyond the farmhouse, the walnut trees appeared. Their branches reached upward without leaves, black lines against the grey sky. Then Phoebe saw the workshop. It was a small timber building, roughly 30 feet wide and 40 feet deep, built with heavy cedar beams and hand-cut boards. The roof sagged along the eastern side. A brick chimney leaned slightly above the back wall. A faded wooden sign hung above the entrance, the letters almost erased by rain. Nutcracker Works. The building looked less abandoned than paused. Phoebe opened the door. The first thing she noticed was the smell. Old paint, dry wood, dust. The second was the silence. The front room held broken shelves and unfinished figures covered with cloth. The floor shifted beneath her boots. Cold air moved through cracks in the walls. In the back room, she found the workbench. The surface was covered with decades of carved marks, knife cuts, pencil lines, small circles where tools had rested thousands of times. She touched the wood. It was cold, but solid. Near the corner stood a life-sized Nutcracker soldier with a painted red coat, faded black boots, and a wooden mouth held open by a large lever mechanism behind its back. The figure was taller than she expected. Its painted eyes looked toward the room. Phoebe spent the afternoon clearing a small space near the fireplace. She found an old blanket, repaired a loose window covering, and carried in enough broken wood to make a small fire. The first night, she slept on the floor beside the workbench. Rain tapped softly against the roof. The building creaked as the temperature dropped. Phoebe placed the deed beside her, placed Elias's cedar shaving beside it, and closed her eyes. The old workshop had been forgotten for years, but the forgotten places often keep the things people leave behind. Phoebe spent the first 3 days learning the rhythm of the property before trying to change it. The well behind the workshop still worked, though the handle resisted each turn like it had not moved in years. She poured water into an old enamel basin, carried it inside, and marked the places where the floor dipped beneath her weight. The outhouse leaned slightly toward the tree line, but the frame remained sound. Every morning she walked across the boards slowly, memorizing which ones complained and which ones held firm. By the third evening, she could cross the room without making the loudest boards speak. The building had its own language. She heard it before she understood it. On the fourth morning, she walked into town looking for supplies and stopped at a small hardware store near the main road. The owner stood behind the counter wearing a faded green work jacket with one sleeve repaired by hand. His left thumb was missing the top joint, and he counted nails by touch rather than sight. His name was Walter Bell. The store was narrow, with wooden shelves rising to the ceiling. The air smelled of metal, sawdust, and the faint oil used on old tools. Walter looked at the list Phoebe carried. "You're fixing the Voss place." She nodded. "Trying." He looked through the window toward the mountains. "That building has survived longer than most people expected." Phoebe placed a few coins on the counter. "I need these supplies." Walter pushed the coins back. "Open a credit account." She looked surprised. "I cannot promise when I can pay." "I did not ask for a promise." He pulled out a small paper form. "Just sign your name." Before she left, Walter handed her a thin repair manual from a shelf near the register. The cover was worn and soft from years of use. "Take this. I cannot buy another book." "You are not buying it." The manual contained old methods for maintaining timber buildings, repairing fireplaces, and restoring traditional wood structures. Several pages had handwritten notes in the margins from previous owners. Phoebe carried it back carefully. The first supplies she purchased later that week were simple. A chimney brush cost $12. A bucket of mortar repair material was $18. A pair of work gloves was $9. A replacement window latch was $6. A small hand saw was $21. Nothing was new. Nothing needed to be. The chimney became the first serious task. The bricks had survived, but the mortar between them had turned soft. When Phoebe scraped the damaged sections, grey powder fell like ash. She spent 2 mornings removing loose creosote build-up from inside the flue with a wire brush attached to a long extension rod. The work was slow. She climbed the roof carefully, cleared debris from the chimney cap, and checked each section before removing anything that could damage the old brick. The creosote inside the upper passage had hardened into black layers that released a sharp tar smell whenever the brush passed through. She worked 6 hours the first day, 8 the next. Her hands smelled of smoke even after washing them. The old manual explained how earlier craftsmen had checked chimney safety by observing airflow, smoke movement, and heat patterns. Phoebe followed the steps exactly. She did not guess. She did not hurry. On the evening of the 7th day, she repaired the last damaged section and waited. The next morning, she built the first fire. The flame started small, then it strengthened. Smoke rose cleanly through the chimney instead of spilling back into the room. Phoebe sat beside the fireplace with a simple meal warming in a small iron pot. Beans, potatoes, and the last of the bread she had purchased that morning. It was the first hot meal she had cooked inside her own home in months. She ate slowly. The workroom behind the back door became her next concern. She entered with a notebook and recorded only the things that mattered. There was a wooden turning lathe with a cracked belt, a collection of carving knives wrapped in cloth, a box of unfinished Nutcracker heads with pencil markings still visible, a hand-painted soldier figure missing one arm, a rack of small chisels arranged by size, a workbench clamp mounted directly into the old timber wall, and in the corner, beneath a sheet of canvas, stood the largest figure in the room, the life-sized Nutcracker. The soldier wore a faded red coat. The paint had dulled, but the carving remained precise. Its wooden beard was made of layered cuts, each one shaped by hand. Phoebe cleaned the dust from the figure carefully. That was when she noticed the lever block behind its back. At first, she thought it was only part of the mechanism. Nutcrackers worked through leverage. A strong wooden bar connected the movement of the handle to the jaw, allowing a person to crack a shell with controlled force. Elias had explained that good design was never about strength alone. It was about direction. Phoebe tested the mechanism. The lever moved, but something was different. The sound was wrong. Not broken. Hollow. She tapped the block with her knuckle. A faint wooden echo answered. She tested another section. Solid. Then the center. Hollow again. She removed the old screws carefully and examined the piece. Behind the lever was a circular cedar disc fitted so precisely that it almost disappeared into the grain. She sat there for several minutes without touching it. The craftsmanship was too careful to be accidental. She lifted the cedar disc. Inside was a narrow space containing several wrapped packages. The first was a bundle of old carving tools. The handles were darkened from years of use, but the blades were clean. The second package contained blocks of unfinished linden wood, selected and stored carefully. The third was a small tin box. Inside the tin box was a copper tube. Phoebe opened it slowly. The papers inside were protected by oilcloth. There was no rush, no dramatic moment, only the sound of paper unfolding after decades of silence. The first pages contained measurements, diagrams, and notes about the Nutcracker mechanism. They showed how the lever system transferred force through specific angles, and how a carefully balanced design could break a hard shell without excessive pressure. At the bottom of the tube was a small envelope containing money. Phoebe counted it once, then again. $34,800. The amount was made from different forms of saved currency: $20 bills, $10 bills, $5 bills, and old silver coins that had been kept inside the wrapping. Among them was a military medal. The engraving showed the year 1944. The name was worn but still readable. She placed everything on the workbench. The money was not what held her attention. It was the notebook pages beneath it. Someone had spent years recording how a wooden machine could accomplish a difficult task through patience, balance, and careful measurement. Phoebe closed the tin box. That night, she did not open the remaining papers. She carried a blanket outside and walked toward the frozen edge of the nearby water. The trees stood dark against the sky. The surface reflected the first stars appearing above the mountains. She sat there until the cold reached her hands. The answer could wait until morning. The old workshop had been forgotten for years, but the forgotten places often keep the things people leave behind. Phoebe waited until morning before opening the envelope. The light entered through the cracked window above the workbench, touching the dust that had settled over the room. She noticed the handwriting before she read the first word. The letters leaned slightly forward, each one pressed with the same careful pressure she remembered from the notes Elias used to leave beside his tools. It was not Elias's writing, but it carried the same patience. The paper had been folded into thirds and protected inside the copper tube. Along the edge was a small stain from time, perhaps from a hand that had held it many years earlier. Phoebe unfolded it. The first words were written clearly. "My dear one, whoever you are," she continued reading. "My dear one, whoever you are, if you're reading this, then the workshop has found another careful pair of hands. My name is Clara Voss. I was the last full-time Nutcracker carver in this shop before my hands became too weak to continue. I'm writing this after receiving my diagnosis of rheumatoid arthritis from Dr. Evelyn Marsh at St. Joseph Medical Center in Wenatchee, Washington, in the spring of 1989. The doctor told me my joints would continue to worsen. She was kind enough not to tell me that the hardest part would not be losing strength, but losing the daily work that had given my life its shape. This workshop belonged to my family for 4 generations. My grandfather, Friedrich Voss, opened the carving room in 1888 after arriving in Leavenworth, Washington, and began making wooden soldiers for the winter markets. My father, Otto Voss, born in 1897, continued the craft after learning beside him and expanded the workshop in 1926. My husband, Samuel Voss, born in 1922, joined the trade after returning from the Pacific War in 1946. Our son, Elias Voss, born in 1951, carried the work forward and became the final teacher of these methods. 4 generations, 1 bench, 1 patient hand after another. The trade officially closed on September 30th. 1 times 8, 9. I locked the door that day believing I would return. I did not. More than 30 years passed. The silence became longer than I expected. But silence is not the same as emptiness. Inside the lever block you will find what I saved from the final years of my work. The money is not payment for what came before. It is not a reward. It is simply what remained after a lifetime of careful living. Use it carefully. Remember that the Nutcracker is not powerful because it is large. It works because the force travels through the correct point. The lever must be fitted so the pressure moves evenly through the wooden joint. The linden wood should be dried below 12% moisture before carving. The first coat of paint should be allowed to cure for at least 24 hours before the next layer is added. When preparing hide glue, keep the mixture near 140 degrees Fahrenheit and never let it boil because rushed heat weakens the bond. Small measurements protect large things. A craftsman does not defeat the material. A craftsman learns its limits. My husband Samuel carried a small military medal from his service during the Second World War. He lost many friends during the Battle of Peleliu in 1944. He rarely spoke about that time, but he always said that people survive difficult seasons because someone remembers how to build again. That is what inheritance truly is. Not objects, not money. Work passed carefully from one person to another. If you restore this place, do not make it perfect. Make it honest. Leave the marks that show someone was here. Let the wood remain wood. Let the tools remain tools. Someone may come after you who needs this place more than you know. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Clara Elise Voss. October 3, 1989. Phoebe read the letter once. Then she read it again. The second time, she noticed the small details. The way Clara had crossed out one sentence and rewritten it. The tiny pressure marks where the pen had stopped. The places where the ink had become lighter because the writer had paused. When Phoebe finished, she folded the pages along the original creases, exactly where Clara had folded them. She walked through the back door carrying the letter. Behind the workshop, near the old walnut trees, she found a flat stone marker partly covered by moss. The name carved into it was simple, Clara Voss. Beneath the name was a date. Phoebe brushed away the dirt with her fingers and sat beside it for several minutes. She did not speak. She simply placed the letter against the stone before carrying it back inside. That afternoon, she cleaned one of the oldest objects from the workbench, a small wooden soldier missing most of its paint. She rubbed beeswax into the surface and lit the old oil lantern that had been hanging beside the carving table. The flame moved gently behind the glass, filling the room with a warm circle of light. The workshop changed, not because the walls changed, because someone had returned. Over the next weeks, Phoebe began remembering the people who had helped her reach that room. Margaret Holloway at the library, who had placed the old advertisement where she could find it. Walter Bell at the hardware store, who gave her supplies before she had money to repay him. Harold Pike, who had pointed her toward the road and watched from his porch to make sure she arrived safely. The librarian who had offered her a chair when she had nowhere else to sit. Small things, quiet things, things that stayed. Before we continue, take a moment and think about this. What is one small kindness someone gave you when you needed it most? It does not have to be a grand gesture. Sometimes a single chair, a warm meal, or a person who simply stayed can change the direction of a life. That night, Phoebe slept beside the workbench with the heirloom tools wrapped carefully near her. The old carving knives rested within reach. The letter remained folded beneath them. For the first time in a long while, she was not sleeping because she had nowhere else to go. She was sleeping because she had chosen to stay. The first snow arrived on December 7th, 2024. By morning, 6 inches covered the yard and the eastern side of the workshop roof had begun dripping again. Phoebe carried Clara's repair manual to the workbench and read the roofing chapter 3 times before touching a single board. The roof measured approximately 30 feet by 40 feet. She calculated the materials carefully. 32 bundles of cedar shingles, 15 rolls of roofing felt, and nearly 4,000 galvanized nails. Walter Bell helped her load the supplies. He also brought something wrapped in an old blanket. "My uncle's roofing hatchet," he said. The wooden handle was dark from decades of use. "I cannot take this." "You are not taking it," Walter answered. "You are continuing it." The local roofer who came to help was Harold Pike's older brother, Thomas, a quiet man who had repaired farm buildings for 50 years. When Phoebe offered payment, he shook his head. "Keep your money for the house." They worked for 11 days. They replaced the damaged sister rafter, snapped fresh chalk lines across the old boards, and aligned each shingle by hand. Thomas showed her the 3-stroke nail technique: place, set, finish. Too much force split the cedar. Too little left the nail exposed. One afternoon, Phoebe hit a nail twice and stopped. Thomas looked over. "That nail's proud." She frowned at the raised head. "What do I do?" "Pull it." She removed it and tried again. By mid-December, the last row of shingles was secured. Snow rested evenly across the roof instead of falling through it. The workshop stayed dry, for the first time in years. The chimney became the next challenge. Several bricks had begun to spall from repeated freezing and thawing. The old mortar fell away in soft pieces whenever Phoebe brushed against it. She removed the damaged sections carefully and rebuilt them with a traditional mixture of hydraulic lime and fireclay, using a ratio of 3 parts lime to 1 part fireclay. The work lasted 3 weeks. Most mornings began below freezing, with temperatures remaining in the 20s Fahrenheit. Every 15 minutes, Phoebe had to stop and warm her hands because her fingers became too numb to grip the trowel properly. She learnt to work slower. The chimney did not need speed. It needed accuracy. Walter checked her progress once and brought coffee. "You are starting to look like this place," he said. Phoebe looked at the dust covering her coat. "I hope that is not an insult." It is not. By late January, She built the test fire. The smoke rose straight upward. No hesitation. No backdraft. The chimney drew cleanly. She sat beside the fireplace that evening and listened to the quiet sound of burning wood. The floors revealed their original character after months beneath dust. Phoebe lifted damaged boards and found white pine planks beneath the surface. The original flooring had been fastened with hand-cut rosehead nails, each one shaped differently. She rented a random orbit sander from town. $14 per day. The restoration required 3 passes. First, 80 grit paper to remove the damaged surface. Second, 120 grit to smooth the grain. Third, 220 grit to prepare the wood for oil. She applied 3 coats, allowing 48 hours of curing between the final applications. The colour changed slowly. The boards moved from dull grey toward a deep honey tone, then settled into a shade closer to old mahogany. Not new. Remembered. One morning, after a night of heavy rain, Phoebe woke early and found the floor work impossible because the humidity was too high. She stepped outside instead. At the marsh behind the property, a great blue heron stood perfectly still beside the water. She watched it for nearly an hour. She did not work that day. The windows took longer than expected. There were 8 in total. 3 had no remaining glass. 4 had cracks running through the panes. 1 contained the original glass from 1788, slightly uneven and full of tiny waves created during the old manufacturing process. Phoebe preserved that one exactly as it was. For the replacements, she used traditional glazing methods. She pressed DAP 333 glazing putty around each pane, creating a smooth seal between glass and wooden frame. The sash cords were replaced with 1/4-inch cotton rope. At each counterweight, she tied a figure-8 knot so the windows could move without slipping. The final window was the smallest one facing the walnut trees. Phoebe worked carefully around the old frame, smoothing the putty with her fingertips. When she finished, she stepped back. A chickadee landed on a branch outside. The bird remained there for several seconds, looking through the restored glass. Then it flew away. The workshop stayed quiet, but it no longer felt abandoned. The walls near the chimney revealed their own history. Phoebe found old horsehair plaster attached to hand-split oak lath, but the area around the fireplace had failed from years of moisture and heat. She patched the section 3 times before understanding the problem. The first patch cracked. The second separated from the old surface. The third held for 2 days before falling away in a quiet pile near the hearth. Walter Bell brought her an old paper bag from the back of his storage room. "My father kept this," he said. Inside was horsehair saved for traditional plaster work. Phoebe mixed lime plaster carefully and applied it in 3 stages. The scratch coat was scored deeply so the next layer could grip. The brown coat was built to 3/8 of an inch and allowed 72 hours to cure. The final finish coat measured only 1/8 inch and required a steady hand. When the surface dried, the repaired section blended with the older walls. Phoebe ran her palm across it. "These patches will hold another 100 years. She did not say it proudly. She said it like a promise. By March, people in town had stopped asking whether Phoebe would actually save the workshop. They started asking what they could bring. Doris, the owner of the small cafe near the library, had a habit of leaving paper bags on the workshop doorstep before sunrise. Inside were bread rolls, soup containers, and sometimes a small jar of jam. Phoebe tried to pay her. Doris always refused. "Save your money," she said. "Pay me in candles when the shop reopens." She wore a silver ring on her thumb and counted change with both hands because arthritis had stiffened her fingers. She never stayed long. She simply left the bags and walked away. Caleb arrived one afternoon on an old Schwinn bicycle with a splitting maul strapped across the back. He was 17, quiet, and always wore a wool hat pulled too low over his eyes. "I brought this," he said. Phoebe looked at the axe. "I cannot pay you," he shook his head. "My mother said." "About your grandfather." That was all. She understood he meant Elias. Caleb split firewood beside the workshop for 3 hours and refused every offer of money. Reverend Boyd walked past the property almost every morning. He was tall, wore a brown coat with worn elbows, and carried the same wooden cane every day. He never entered. He only tipped his hat toward the workshop and said a 4-word prayer. "Keep careful hands, Lord." Then he continued down the road. The workshop changed through small arrivals. A bag of food, a sharpened tool, a few minutes of quiet company. Nothing announced itself. Everything remained. Phoebe postponed the cellar until February 11th. The ground was too hard before then. When she finally opened the entrance, she found a 12 by 15-foot fieldstone floor beneath layers of dirt. 7 granite steps descended into the space, each worn slightly in the center from generations of footsteps. At the center of the cellar was a dressed granite slab. A small craft mark had been carved into its surface. Phoebe cleaned around it. She measured the edges. She looked for a seam. She found one. But she did not lift it. Some things deserved to remain closed. While checking the 3rd granite step, she noticed a small gap beneath the stone. Wedged inside was an oak box no larger than her hand. Inside was a brass key. The bow of the key was shaped like the symbol used by traditional nutcracker makers, a small curved jaw and lever. There was also a tintype photograph. Phoebe held it near the lantern. The image showed a young woman standing outside the cottage in summer clothing, holding a carving tool. The woman's face was worn by age, but the shape of the eyes stopped Phoebe. On the back, written in faded ink, were the words, "Clara Elise Voss, daughter of Friedrich Voss, age 25. Summer of 1903. Phoebe carried the key upstairs. She placed it on the mantel. She did not know what it opened. She decided she could wait. By April, the snow had disappeared. The creek behind the property grew louder each morning. Walnut branches developed small green catkins, and the ground softened beneath the trees. Phoebe considered beginning the full nutcracker craft. She decided against it. The tools had waited decades. She could wait one more season. She used only 1 coin from the collection to buy small pieces of linden wood and practice material. The first attempts were uneven. The cuts were too deep. The curves were too impatient. She kept every mistake. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Phoebe finished her first complete heritage craft object. It was not a large soldier. It was a small wooden nutcracker figure standing 12 inches tall. She carved the body from linden wood that had dried for months beneath the workshop shelves. She shaped the mouth mechanism slowly, following Clara's notes about pressure and balance. The uniform was painted by hand with thin layers, allowing each coat to cure before adding another. The figure was not perfect. The beard had a slight unevenness. The left boot was a fraction wider than the right. Phoebe kept it that way. It showed the person who made it. The restored interior of the workshop remained simple. The old workbench stood beneath the window. Clara's tools rested in their original places. The fireplace warmed the front room. The original 1788 window still held its uneven glass, catching winter light in small waves. Nothing had been replaced that did not need replacing. Nothing had been hidden that deserved to remain visible. The brass key stayed on the mantel until December 18th. That morning, after another careful search through the property records and old notes, Phoebe returned to the walnut tree behind the workshop. One branch held a small iron plate nearly covered by bark. The key fit. Inside the narrow compartment was a folded 48-star American flag and a note wrapped in oilcloth. The handwriting belonged to Clara's mother, Anna Voss. The note was dated June 6th, 1944. It had been written during the same year. Samuel Voss would later serve in the Pacific War. Anna wrote about waiting, about sons leaving home, about families keeping faith when they did not know what tomorrow would bring. She wrote that objects were only important because they carried the hands of the people who cared for them. Phoebe folded the note carefully. She placed the flag back inside the compartment. The military medal from 1944 was later honoured at Tahoma National Cemetery on Memorial Day, May 27th, 2025. There was no crowd, no announcement. Only a quiet moment beside other names. The money from the lever block remained mostly untouched. Phoebe used 3 coins from the collection for necessary materials and sealed the rest inside the original copper tube. On the label attached to the box, she wrote, "For the next one." The workshop reopened quietly. There was no ceremony. Doris placed an index card on the cafe corkboard. Traditional Nutcracker carving lessons available. By the end of the first month, more than 40 names had been written on the small mailing list. Most people never asked about the money. They asked about the wood. They asked about the tools. They asked how long it took to learn. Caleb returned in early spring carrying a wooden sign he had carved himself. It was made from walnut. The letters were simple. Voss, Nutcracker's daughters. Phoebe ran her hand across the final word. "You added that?" Caleb shrugged. "My mother said, 'Crafts belong to whoever keeps them alive.' She hung the sign beside the old entrance, years after finding Clara's letter. Phoebe began writing her own. She used the same opening words, 'My dear one, whoever you are.' She wrote about the first cold night on the floor, about the people who left food at the door, about the tools that waited, about the importance of leaving something useful behind. She did not write because she believed someone would discover her story. She wrote because someone might need the words later. The old workshop had been forgotten for years, but the forgotten places often keep the things people leave behind. The lesson of the lever block was never really about breaking a shell. It was about understanding where strength travels. A small movement, a careful hand, a point of balance. That was how the workshop survived. That was how Phoebe survived. The Nutcracker carver's workshop waits. It has always waited. The property no longer belonged only to one person. It belonged to every careful hand that entered, learned, repaired, and left something behind. The old dollar bill from the original $9 remained in Margaret Holloway's desk drawer at the county clerk's office. She kept it inside a small envelope marked with the date Phoebe signed the deed. She never spent it. She said some things were not valuable because of what they could buy. They were valuable because they proved someone had chosen to begin again.